Hey guys, tonight we begin with a bed that is colder than the room around it. Not frozen solid, just cold enough that the first touch of the sheets makes your shoulders tighten. The farmhouse has a fire downstairs. You can hear a faint iron tick from the stove as the metal cools. But up here, in the bedroom, the mattress, sheets, bed frame, and wash pitcher have been giving their warmth away for hours. Climb in too quickly, and the bed begins taking heat from you before you have had time to settle. That is the first modern illusion we need to lose. A fire in an 1800s farmhouse did not mean the house was warm. It usually meant one part of the house was warm enough to gather around. The kitchen or main room might be comfortable near the stove, while a hallway, stair, or bedroom remained cold enough to make undressing feel like a poor decision. The bed, then, became its own tiny heating project. In some households, a long-handled warming pan could be filled with hot coals and moved carefully between the sheets. In others, a heated brick, stone, or container of hot water might be wrapped and carried upstairs. These objects did not improve the bedroom air. They prepared the narrow space where a body would soon lie, which is honestly a much smaller contract. Central heating existed in a few wealthy houses and large institutions. The 1859 heating system at St. Elizabeth's Hospital is one example, but it was not the normal reality of modest rural farmhouses. A clearer scale appears in the two-room cottage Jesse Hoover and his father built in West Branch, Iowa, in 1871. One room held 2 adults and 3 children. The other combined kitchen, dining room, and living room. In winter, one wood-burning cookstove heated that main room. 5 people, 2 rooms, 1 principal fire. Before we follow that fading warmth through the house, if you enjoy quiet history built from cold floors, iron stoves, and people working far too hard for one comfortable blanket, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what the weather feels like where you are tonight. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a modest farmhouse somewhere in the colder parts of 19th century America. The exact house changes with region, wealth, and decade. A Midwestern household later in the century might own a cast-iron cookstove that served as both kitchen equipment and the main source of heat. A poorer family might have fewer rooms, thinner bedding, and less fuel to spare. A New England house, an Appalachian cabin, and a farmhouse on the Iowa prairie did not face winter with identical materials or routines. But the problem was widely recognizable. Once the sun went down, the family had to decide how much of the house could remain part of daily life. The warmest room was usually the room where fuel was burning. Meals, mending, reading, conversation, and small evening tasks gathered around the same source of heat. Chairs moved closer, damp gloves were placed where they might dry without scorching. A kettle sat within reach. Boots waited near the edge of warmth, giving off the smell of leather and mud. Farther away, the house divided into colder zones. Near the stove, your face might feel hot. A few steps away, your back could still feel a draft. Open a door, and cold air from the next room would slide across the floor. Go upstairs, and some heat might have risen, but not enough to create the soft, even comfort a modern person expects from a bedroom. A farmhouse behaved less like one heated box and more like a chain of spaces competing for a limited supply of warmth. And warmth began long before bedtime. The fuel had to be cut, split, dried, stacked, protected from weather, carried indoors, and fed to the fire. Ash had to be removed. Chimneys and stovepipes had to be watched. Wet or green wood could burn badly and smoke. Dry wood burned better, that somebody had prepared it earlier, often weeks or months before it disappeared into the stove. The pleasant orange glow was stored labour. Every log represented time in the woodlot, a swing of the axe, sore hands, and another trip between the pile and the house. The farmhouse thermostat, in other words, had boots and a backache. By evening, fuel became a household budget. Burn too little, and the room cooled early. Burn too much, and the woodpile shrank faster than planned. A larger fire might make the main room uncomfortably hot, while doing little for a closed bedroom at the far end of the house. So the family learned to move through temperature rather than control it. You warmed yourself while you could. You finished tasks requiring bare hands. You prepared clothing for morning. You made certain that anything needed during the night was close enough to find without wandering through cold rooms. Then, before leaving the heat, you carried part of it with you. A warming pan was one answer, at least for households that owned one. It was usually a metal pan with a hinged lid and long handle. Hot coals could be placed inside, and the pan moved through the bed to take the raw chill from the sheets. The handle allowed the user to reach deep into the bed without climbing in beside live coals, which would have been an exciting but very brief improvement to the heating system. The work required care. A coal could escape. Fabric could scorch. The pan had to keep moving. It was a tool for transferring heat, not something to leave under the blankets. Simpler substitutes followed the same logic. A brick warmed near the hearth might be wrapped in cloth and placed near the feet. A stone or hot water vessel could offer a small reserve of warmth. None transformed the room. They gave the body a warm point around which to settle. Most of the nighttime strategy was about slowing loss. Blankets, quilts, nightclothes, stockings, caps, and sometimes bed curtains trapped body-warmed air close to the skin, creating a small climate inside a room that remained cold. But getting into that comfort required a small act of courage. You undressed quickly, avoided cold wood and metal, and entered before the borrowed warmth disappeared. Sharing a bed reduced privacy, but added body heat, making sleeping arrangements part of the winter calculation. Downstairs, the fire continued to settle. Some families tried to preserve embers beneath ash so the morning fire would be easier to revive. The exact method varied, and not every stove or hearth behaved the same way. Yet the hope was simple. Do not let every trace of usable heat vanish before dawn. The room dimmed. Iron contracted with small clicks. The stove became a dark shape. Heat withdrew from the corners. Then the floor. Then the furniture. Upstairs, the bed held its little pocket of warmth as long as the blankets remained closed. And somewhere beneath the grey ash, one ember waited. It was not much, but it carried the logic of the farmhouse night. Warmth had to be made, moved, trapped, rationed, and protected. Only certain places became warm, and only because someone had spent the day preparing them. By morning, that ember would have to become a fire again. Before we reach that cold floor and the first hand searching through ash, we need to understand the strange map of the farmhouse itself, because the next question is not simply how much heat the family had, it is where that heat was allowed to live. The answer began with the room that held the fire. In many farmhouses, that meant the kitchen, the keeping room, or one principal living space where cooking, eating, mending, reading, and evening conversation collapsed into the same pool of heat. The names varied by region and household, but the logic was practical. If one stove or hearth had to perform several jobs, the family gathered those jobs around it. That room became the centre of winter life. A pot simmered close to the fire. Wet mittens hung nearby. A child leaned toward the stove until someone told him to move back. A chair that had seemed comfortably placed in summer was dragged several feet closer once the weather changed. Even the family cat, if there was one, understood the floor plan better than any architect. Near the stove, the air could feel almost too warm. Iron radiated heat directly. A kettle added moisture and sound. Clothing began to dry. Faces flushed. But the comfort was local. Turn your back toward a cold wall and the difference could be immediate. Stand near a poorly fitted window and a stream of colder air might move down the glass and across the floor. The room contained its own climate zones. There was the prized chair beside the heat. There was the useful strip where boots could dry without burning. There was the table, warm enough for hands to work. Then there were the edges, the doorway, the wall, the floorboards, and the places where air found its way through cracks. Furniture placement mattered more than it appears in nostalgic paintings. A table was not simply arranged for beauty. A bed, bench, cradle, spinning wheel, or work chair might be placed with heat, smoke, light, and drafts in mind. The household learned which corner remained tolerable after sunset and which one belonged to winter. Opening a door redrew the map. Cold air from an adjoining room entered low, sliding across the floor. Warmer air escaped higher through the same opening. The person standing in the doorway felt both movements at once, chill around the ankles and warmth leaving overhead. No one needed a lesson in fluid dynamics. They only needed bare feet. Doors controlled access to warmth. Closing one could protect the main room, but it also surrendered whatever lay beyond it. A parlour used for formal visits might remain cold most of the time. A spare bedroom could become little more than storage until guests arrived. Work that could be carried into the warm room often was. The household reduced its winter territory. A large house might look like wealth, but every additional room created another volume of air, another window, another wall, and another invitation for heat to disappear. A small house could feel crowded, smoky, and inconvenient, yet crowding also concentrated bodies and activity near the fire. The grander farmhouse offered privacy and status, but winter charged rent for every doorway. Walk the route from the warm room to an upstairs bed. You leave the stove, cross the first draft near the door, and place one foot on the staircase. Some warmer air rises through the stairwell, but the rail is cold. Halfway up, the smell of cooking weakens. At the top, a closed bedroom door blocks whatever heat might have followed you. Inside, the wash water has chilled. The bed frame feels hard under the hand, and the window announces every change in the wind. Warm air did rise, but that simple fact did not guarantee a comfortable upper floor. Heat could collect near the ceiling of the room below without moving efficiently into a closed bedroom. Stairways allowed some warmth upward, though they also gave it another route to escape. Poorly sealed roofs, thin walls, exposed corners, and distant windows could take back much of what arrived. A bedroom above the main room might be less severe than one over an unheated space. A small chamber tucked near a chimney could receive some benefit from masonry warmed below. But these advantages were measured in degrees of discomfort, not modern room-by-room control. The family knew this without thermometers. They knew which stair carried a cold draught. They knew which bedroom window collected moisture or frost under certain conditions. They knew where the water pitcher became painfully cold by morning. They knew which child complained first, and which relative quietly moved closer to the kitchen after supper. Temperature was read through objects and bodies. Butter hardened. Washwater chilled. Metal felt sharper to the hand. Breath might become visible in a colder room. A wooden floor pulled heat from bare feet so quickly that the journey from bed to clothing became a planned operation rather than a casual beginning to the day. The bed itself was another heat zone. Once warmed and occupied, it could hold comfort surprisingly well under layers of blankets and quilts. Leave it, however, and the room immediately reclaimed the body. This created a strong nightly incentive to complete every task before climbing in. A forgotten candle, cup, garment, or chamber pot could become an argument with yourself conducted entirely beneath the covers. History rarely records that argument, but the architecture makes it easy to understand. The difference between rooms also reflected money. A household with a well-made stove, adequate seasoned wood, tighter construction, storm protection, heavy curtains, good bedding, and enough hands to manage the work had more options. A poorer family might possess fewer blankets, less reliable fuel, more crowded sleeping quarters, or a structure that admitted wind freely. Two neighbouring farmhouses could face the same weather and provide very different nights. Even within one house, warmth was not distributed equally. Someone might sleep nearer the chimney. Someone else might take the room above the kitchen. A guest could be offered the better bed, forcing a child or younger relative elsewhere. Hired workers might sleep in an attic, loft, outbuilding, or less desirable room depending on the farm and region. Older people, infants, and those who were ill required more protection, but need did not always guarantee that sufficient warmth was available. The floor plan became a quiet expression of household rank. Privacy could also become a luxury. Sharing a sleeping room, or sometimes a bed, reduced personal space but increased the amount of body heat held beneath the coverings. A modern viewer may see only crowding. The household also saw fuel, bedding, available rooms, age, propriety, and necessity. People adapted to their homes through clothing, routine, placement, and expectation. Their standard of comfort differed from ours, but adaptation still required work. The warm room existed because fuel had been carried into it. The warm bed existed because someone prepared it. The closed room stayed cold because the household could not justify spending heat there. Every comfortable corner was surrounded by spaces where comfort had been withdrawn. As the evening advanced, the map contracted further. The table was cleared. Small tasks ended. One person checked the stove. Another gathered clothing for morning. Doors remained shut. Footsteps moved upstairs. The lively circle around the fire dissolved into separate beds holding separate pockets of warmth. Behind them, the main room began to cool. The chair nearest the stove lost its advantage first. The kettle stopped murmuring. The window became a dark rectangle. Warm air settled into objects and then slowly abandoned them. The farmhouse had been occupied strategically, and before that strategy could work for another night, the household needed something far less romantic than a glowing window in the snow. It needed fuel. Not merely a few attractive logs beside the hearth, but a winter supply, cut, split, dried, stacked, carried, and measured against the weeks still waiting ahead. Fuel was only useful once the household had somewhere to burn it, and in the 19th century that somewhere could change the character of a winter night. An open fireplace and a cast-iron stove both made heat, but not in the same way. Stand close to a fireplace, and the front of your body feels the difference immediately. Flames radiate outward, your face warms, your hands loosen, a wet sleeve begins to steam. The room looks alive because the fire is visible, moving and noisy. Now take one step to the side. The warmth weakens. Turn your back, and the contrast becomes clearer. The front of your coat may feel hot, while your shoulders remain cold. A fireplace gives strong, local comfort, but much of the hot air moves upward into the chimney. The same opening that carries smoke away also pulls room air toward the fire and out of the house. The chimney is doing necessary work. It is also being slightly rude about it. In a farmhouse built around a hearth, the fireplace might cook food, heat water, dry clothing, provide light, and offer the main source of warmth. A pot hung over the fire. Iron tools leaned nearby. Ash gathered below. Sparks occasionally escaped onto stone or brick meant to contain them. Heat from the flames warmed nearby bodies and objects, but it did not settle reliably into every corner. Cold air entered through cracks to replace air leaving through the chimney. The closer the household clustered around the hearth, the more useful the fire became. Move into an adjoining room, and much of its advantage disappeared. This is why old images of families gathered around a fireplace are both accurate and misleading. Yes, people gathered there. They gathered there because the rest of the room was worse. A cast-iron stove changed the arrangement. Instead of allowing fire to burn openly in a large masonry opening, the stove enclosed it inside iron. The metal body absorbed heat and radiated it into the surrounding room. Smoke travelled through a pipe toward the chimney, rather than entering a broad, open throat above the flames. The stove turned fire into machinery. A Smithsonian example, the compact Bell No. 18 made by the Richmond Stove Company in Virginia, shows the basic features clearly. A cast-iron body, an opening for a stovepipe, a front vent, a removable cook surface, and the sort of draft control used to regulate heat. Similar stoves could burn wood or coal according to design, budget, and local fuel access. That single object cannot stand for every farmhouse stove. It does make the operating logic visible. The stove could be fed through a door. Airflow could be adjusted through drafts. Depending on design, household, and region, it might burn wood, coal, or another suitable fuel. Some stoves were built mainly for heating. Others combined cooking and heating, making the kitchen or main room even more important during winter. A cast iron cookstove could hold pots on its top while its heated surfaces warmed the room. Damp gloves could be placed nearby, though not so nearby that the family learned an expensive lesson about wool. The user still had to make it behave. Open the draft too far and fuel could burn quickly. Restrict it too much and the fire might weaken or smoke. Add green wood and the result could be disappointing. Allow ash to build in the wrong place and airflow suffered. A poorly drawing pipe or chimney could push smoke where no one wanted it. Better equipment replaced some problems with more adjustable problems. The stove also altered how people positioned themselves. A fireplace mainly projected warmth from one side. A freestanding or partly exposed stove could radiate from several surfaces. Chairs might be placed around it rather than only in front of it. A room could receive heat more evenly, at least compared with the hot and cold divide of an open hearth. But evenly is a relative word. The area near the stove could become uncomfortably hot, while windows and outside walls remained cold. A child sitting close enough might be ordered back. Someone entering from outdoors could crowd near the iron until fingers began to sting as they warmed. The best locations still had value, and everyone knew where it was. The stove became part of the household rhythm. A door opened, a log entered, the draft was adjusted, iron clicked and expanded. Later, as the fire declined, the same metal clicked again while cooling. The difference between hearth and stove also involved cooking. In an open hearth arrangement, preparing food meant managing pots, hooks, coals, and heat at different distances from the flame. The cook worked close to smoke, sparks, and uneven heat. At Fort Scott, National Park Service interpreters described the cook rising early to start the hearth and tending it last at night, banking coals for morning. Useful cooking depended less on dramatic flames than on controlled heat and a dependable bed of coals. A cook stove brought pots onto a flatter surface and offered more controlled spaces, though control still depended on experience. The person using it needed to know which part ran hottest, how the fuel behaved, when the oven was ready, and how much heat would remain after the meal. There was no digital display. The setting was, "The iron feels like this," which becomes useful only after several opportunities to be wrong. A stove represented investment as well as improvement. Buying and installing one required money, a safe position, a pipe, a working chimney connection, and continuing maintenance. Technology arrived unevenly. Cast iron cookstoves were being manufactured in the 1820s and 1830s, but early adoption favoured prosperous households and large establishments. Rural families did not all replace hearths on the same schedule. Cost, transport, preference, building design, and access to repair shaped the change. A prosperous farmhouse later in the century might have a capable cookstove, and perhaps another heating stove elsewhere. A smaller or poorer household might depend on one stove for nearly everything. Another family might continue using an older fireplace because replacing it was impractical or unaffordable. Old and new methods overlapped. A house might keep its fireplace while adding a stove elsewhere. Buildings adapted slowly, because winter rarely waits for renovations. Even the better stove remained local. A closed bedroom upstairs might receive only a faint share of its heat. A room on the far side of the house could remain cold. The stove improved the thermal centre. It did not erase distance, drafts, thin walls, or the amount of air surrounding it. At night, an enclosed stove could sometimes be managed more deliberately than an open hearth. Fuel might be arranged and drafts adjusted in the hope that usable embers would remain by morning. Practices varied by stove, fuel, and household, and unattended fire carried risk. Still, controlled airflow gave families another way to stretch heat into darkness. Stretch was the important word. As the fuel settled, the room cooled. The iron released stored heat. A kettle remained warm. Objects close to the stove held some of what they had absorbed. Eventually the clicks became less frequent, the surface dulled, and the room began surrendering its warmth. No stove could release heat that had not first been placed inside it. Behind every quiet winter scene stood a fuel pile, disappearing piece by piece. Each evening reduced it. Each cold spell accelerated the loss. Each poorly dried log gave less useful heat, while demanding the same trip indoors. The question was no longer simply whether the farmhouse owned a fireplace or a stove. It was whether the household could keep feeding either one until spring. And that answer waited outside, under snow, beside an axe, in a woodpile that had taken months to build. The woodpile had already decided how warm the farmhouse could afford to become. By the time snow settled around the buildings, most of the important work should have happened earlier. Trees had been selected, cut, sectioned, split, moved, and stacked. The wood needed time to dry. A log that looked solid could still contain enough moisture to burn slowly, smoke heavily, and produce less useful heat than expected. Winter exposed every mistake made during the warmer months. A poorly covered stack collected rain. Wood laid on wet ground began to rot. Pieces cut too large were awkward for the stove. Pieces left unsplit dried more slowly. A family that underestimated its needs could not solve the problem by turning a dial. It had to find more fuel. When roads, fields, and woodlots had become harder to cross, the fire burning quietly indoors therefore began outside, with noise. An axe struck the end of a log. The blade sank, stopped, and had to be pulled free. Another blow followed. When the grain opened cleanly, the wood separated with a crack. When it did not, the person splitting it changed the angle or reached for a wedge. This was repetitive, physical, necessary work. The division of labour varied. Men and older boys often performed much of the heavy cutting and hauling in many farming communities, but women, younger children, hired workers, and older relatives could all move smaller pieces, gather kindling, tend fires, or manage the indoor supply. Weather, illness, absence, and poverty regularly ignored neat job descriptions. Coal did not care whose task it was supposed to be. Once split, wood still had to reach a place where it could dry. A useful stack allowed air to move while keeping much of the rain and snow away. Stack badly and the pile leaned. Stack too tightly and moisture lingered. Leave the top exposed and weather began undoing the work. A wood pile was both fuel and calendar. At the start of winter, it looked reassuring. Rows of split pieces promised meals, warm hands, heated water, dried clothing, and tolerable nights. As the weeks passed, empty space appeared. A severe cold spell could eat into the stack quickly. Every armful carried indoors made the remaining season more visible. The family did not merely see wood. It saw February. A child sent outside for fuel left a warm room and crossed into the cold. Snow gathered on the pieces. Bark caught on sleeves. The wood came in against the chest, leaving dust and flakes across the floor. One trip might supply an evening. It would not supply a winter. Someone returned again the next day. Near the stove, an indoor wood box created a small reserve. Keeping fuel close allowed it to warm and dry further, but bringing too much indoors invited clutter, dirt, and sparks near combustible material. The household balanced convenience against safety, which is a polite way of saying that winter gave everyone several bad options. Kindling mattered as much as larger pieces. A cold stove could not be persuaded by confidence. It needed dry shavings, twigs, thin splits, paper where available, or another material that caught quickly. Above that came slightly larger pieces, then fuel capable of sustaining the fire. Building in the wrong order produced smoke, frustration, and several warm-looking logs doing very little. The household learned to read the materials. Dry wood sounded different when struck. Some species split easily, others resisted. Resinous pieces might catch well. Dense hardwoods could provide longer-lasting heat, while softer woods often burned faster. At Fort Scott, the preferred hearthwoods listed by interpreters include ash, oak, hickory, hard maple, and dogwood because good cooking wood needed to produce strong, even heat and useful coals. Families used what region, land, and budget allowed. In wooded parts of New England or Appalachia, household access to a woodlot could shape the entire heating routine. On more open prairie land, fuel could become a different calculation. Coal was practical only where mines, towns, canals, or railroads brought it close enough and cheaply enough. A stove advertised as able to burn several fuels did not create those fuels outside the door. Geography entered the house with every load. The stove translated those choices into heat. A small piece gave a quick flame, a heavier piece lasted longer. Poorly seasoned fuel hissed or smouldered. Open the stove door, and the room briefly received smoke, sparks, or a sharp rush of heat. Close it, adjust the draft, and wait. Then came the ash. Every fire left material behind. Ash accumulated beneath or around the fuel depending on the stove. Too much could interfere with airflow. Removing it meant working with dust fine enough to find clothing, skin, floorboards, and lungs with impressive efficiency. The ash pan or shovel had to be handled carefully. Embers could remain alive beneath a surface that appeared grey and harmless. Ash placed in a wooden container or too close to combustible material could start a fire long after the household believed the danger had passed. The dullest waste from the stove still demanded respect. Wood ash could be reused for tasks such as soap making or cleaning, but it still had to be carried and stored. Smoke created another layer of maintenance. A chimney or stovepipe that drew well helped remove smoke and gases. A poor draft pushed smoke back into the room. Soot and creosote could collect in flues, especially when fires burned cool or wood was damp. Cleaning and inspection reduced risk, though practice varied. A chimney problem might reveal itself through smell, weak fire, or something much more alarming. The heating system included the fuel, the person carrying it, the air moving through the house, the pipe, the ash under the grate, and the weather pressing against the walls. Money shaped every link. A family with access to its own woodlot occupied a different position from one buying fuel or depending on permission to cut it. Land ownership did not eliminate labour, but it changed access. Horses, a wagon, strong tools, hired help, or older children could make preparation easier than it was for a household with few hands. Illness could reduce the fuel supply without changing the weather. An injured arm, a sick parent, or an absent worker turned heating into an immediate problem. Fuel was tied directly to human capacity. Even a prepared family rationed attention. The stove needed feeding during cooking, wood came in before darkness, ash left, clothing dried, children stayed away from hot iron. Warmth could fail at several points. By late evening, the remaining wood beside the stove became part of the bedtime calculation. How cold would the night become? How quickly did this stove consume fuel? Could the fire be arranged to last? Would enough ember remain to make morning easier? A large final log might burn longer, but only if it was dry and the stove could manage it. Too much airflow consumed fuel quickly. Too little could weaken the fire and increase smoke. No rule worked equally for every stove, chimney, fuel, or wind. Experience filled the space where modern controls would later appear. Someone bent near the iron door, watched the flame, adjusted the draft, and listened. The decision lasted only a moment, but months of preparation stood behind it. Outside, the woodpile waited under snow, slightly smaller than it had been that morning. Inside, the final armful waited beside the stove. Before the household could climb into its cold bedrooms, those pieces had to carry the warm room through the last hours of evening. That was when heating stopped being a supply problem and became a ritual of timing. Supper ending, doors closing, clothing drying, beds being prepared, and the farmhouse shrinking toward the fire before night fully arrived. The ritual began before anyone admitted that the day was over. Supper still occupied the stove. A pot simmered over the strongest heat the household expected to use that evening. Steam lifted when the lid moved. Boots stood in a dark row by the wall, their leather slowly drying. A damp mitten had been given the best place near the iron and was already in danger of becoming the household's most carefully supervised garment. During the last hour or two before bed, the stove had to do nearly everything. First came the meal. Cooking required dependable heat, so the fire was fed while there was still food to boil, fry, bake, or keep warm. Water could be heated at the same time, the stove room filled with the smell of food, damp wool, smoke, and people who had spent the day moving between colder places. As supper ended, the heat was reassigned. Dishes left the table. A kettle remained on the stove. Wet gloves and stockings rotated toward the warmer positions. A coat that had been too close was moved back. A boot was turned so the other side could dry. The stove was being asked to cook, dry, warm, and prepare the night all at once. This was efficient in the same way carrying every grocery bag in one trip is efficient. It works beautifully until something falls. After the dishes were cleared, the household began reducing the number of places that mattered. A door to an unused room stayed closed. A parlour, if the house had one, might be surrendered to the cold. Sewing, mending, reading, repairs, and conversation gathered within the stove's useful radius. The farmhouse became smaller by the quarter hour. A child sat near the table, with cold, reddened hands. An older relative took the chair that caught the least draught. Someone tested a mitten and found the inside still damp. Beyond the closed door, another room waited in darkness, with no fuel being spent on it. Closing that door preserved one pocket of comfort and abandoned another. Households used whatever barriers their buildings and means provided. Shutters and curtains could reduce drafts or slow heat loss, though their usefulness depended on fit, material, and weather. Rugs or other floor coverings made cold floors less punishing where families possessed them. Cloth might be pressed against a troublesome gap. These measures bought time. The person tending the fire watched how the room responded. If the evening turned colder, or wind pressed against the house, the stove might need more fuel. If everyone had gathered close and the room became too hot, the draft could be adjusted or less wood added. There was no single correct setting. The household led the stove through flame, sound, smoke, iron, and habit. A strong fire might roar, a weak one settled low. Green wood complained in its own way. The chimney behaved differently under changing wind. Someone familiar with the stove knew signs that would never appear in an instruction manual. Before the youngest child went upstairs, bedtime clothing was prepared. Nightshirts, stockings, caps, or other layers could be placed where they gained some warmth, though any cloth near flame or hot iron required care. Morning clothing might also be arranged within reach, so that no one had to search through a cold room before dressing. The goal was to remove unnecessary minutes of exposure. A boot left damp might be miserable by morning. A stocking that failed to dry was not a small inconvenience when the next day began outdoors. Dry clothing appeared beside the bed because somebody had carried, checked, turned, and moved it. Comfort often looked like an object. Its real form was attention. As one lamp became the main light in the room, the household prepared for darkness. Anything needed upstairs had to be gathered before the warm room dissolved. Water, clothing, a candle or lamp, and personal necessities were collected. A forgotten item became more expensive once everyone was in bed. The price was leaving the blankets. This is the point in the evening when even a spoon in the wrong room could become a personal enemy. Now the fire changed purpose. It no longer had to support active cooking or a room full of movement. The family wanted it to last. The final arrangement depended on the hearth or stove, the available fuel, and household practice. Larger pieces might be added. Airflow could be adjusted. In some situations, embers were managed in hopes that enough heat would survive until morning. These were not universal methods, and careless fire management carried real danger. The nightly question remained the same. How much fire could be preserved without burning through too much fuel or putting the house at risk? Someone opened the stove door. Heat touched the face. The final selected piece of wood entered. Sparks shifted. The door closed. And the draft was adjusted with the confidence of experience or the confidence of someone about to be corrected by smoke. Iron remained hot. The kettle stayed warm. Furniture close to the stove held a little heat. The family finished the last tasks while the fire was still generous. Then the departures began. A younger child went upstairs with an adult carrying a light. Another person checked the door latch. Water was moved. The last damp garment was turned. Anything too close to the heat was pulled away. The house became quieter, one body at a time. A door opened. Cold air moved in low. Warm air escaped above. Footsteps climbed the stairs, and the door closed again. Upstairs, bedrooms had been waiting without much participation in the evening. The air felt sharper. Bed frames, walls, pictures, and floorboards had spent hours cooling. The body arriving from the stoveroom carried warmth in clothing and skin, but the room immediately began taking it back. Stay too long downstairs and the bed remained cold. Go upstairs too early and the body left the best heat before necessary. Prepare a warming object too soon and it cooled before use. The nightly routine was a transfer operation. Heat moved from fuel into iron, from iron into the main room, from the room into clothing, and from a warming tool into the bed. Each movement lost something along the way. The household could only arrange the order carefully enough that useful warmth reached the final destination. Class and available labour changed how smoothly the sequence worked. A household with more bedding, a reliable stove, seasoned fuel, and several capable hands had room for error. A poorer family with limited wood, thin coverings, or illness had fewer choices. The same weather did not create the same bedtime. Eventually, only one person remained in the main room. The chair was pushed back. The table stood cleared. A hand hovered near the iron, judging what the fire might do after the room was empty. Was the stove door secure? Was anything combustible too close? Was enough fuel arranged for the remaining hours? Would there be an ember by morning? The questions had no perfect answer. The night would decide. The last light left the room. Behind it, the stove continued giving off heat to empty chairs and cooling walls. Upstairs, the family faced the most intimate part of the heating system. All that remained was to take one small portion of the room's warmth upstairs and persuade a cold bed to keep it. The first challenge was that a bed could feel colder than the room around it. Mattress, frame, sheets, and blankets had spent the day absorbing the temperature of the bedroom. By the time someone arrived from the stoveroom, the bedding held no welcome. It waited, flat and cold, ready to take heat from the body entering it. A prepared bed changed that first moment. In households that owned one, a warming pan offered a direct solution. The object was usually made of metal, with a shallow, covered pan fixed to a long handle. Hot coals or another heated material could be placed inside, and the pan moved carefully between the sheets. The Smithsonian preserves examples made from copper, brass, wood, and iron, classified specifically as bedroom heating equipment. Some surviving American pans date from the 18th century, which matters because the technology remained available to later households, even when the individual object had been inherited rather than newly purchased. The goal was not to leave it beneath the blankets. The pan moved from the head of the bed toward the foot and back again, giving its heat to fabric that had spent the day cooling. The bedroom air still felt sharp against the face. Only the sheets changed. The long handle kept the user's hand away from hot metal and allowed the pan to reach deep into the bed. Openings in the lid could release warmth while helping contain the contents. Contain is the important word. A loose coal, an overheated pan, or fabric left in contact too long could scorch bedding or begin something far worse. The user had to keep it moving and watch the cloth. Warm the bed, do not cook it. That seems obvious until we remember that the room is dim, the user may be tired, and the device contains material recently taken from a fire. A dark mark on a sheet could preserve the memory of one careless pause. Such marks rarely appear in romantic winter scenes, perhaps because singed linen affects the mood. Purpose-made warming pans also carried a cost. Copper, brass, ironwork, and a fitted handle represented materials and skilled production. Some households owned them. Others borrowed, inherited, improvised, or went without. A poorer family still needed warm feet without the polished metal solution. A brick warmed near the hearth might be wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed. A suitable stone could serve a similar purpose where local practice supported it. The material had to be chosen and heated carefully. A cracked or unsuitable stone, or one heated too rapidly, could create danger rather than comfort. Imagine the small scene. A child stands beside the bed, while an adult tests the wrapped brick through the cloth. It must be warm enough to help, but not hot enough to burn skin or damage the coverings. The bundle disappears beneath the blankets. For a few minutes, the foot of the bed becomes the warmest place in the room. The contrast between the metal pan and the wrapped brick is useful, but it should not be turned into a perfect class diagram. A prosperous family might still use a simple brick. A poor household might own an inherited pan. Objects moved between generations and across economic lines. What changed most reliably was the range of options. The market kept offering new ones. In 1847, George H. Thatcher of Ballston, New York, patented a water-heated foot stove with compartments for the feet and a lamp beneath the water chamber. In 1855, Nathaniel Waterman of Boston patented hot water foot warmers, including a model intended for use in a bed. A Philadelphia patent from 1865 proposed a box warmed by hot water or sand and lined inside with wool. These patent models prove invention, not widespread ownership. They show that people were actively trying to carry small amounts of heat into carriages, churches, workrooms, and beds. That wider use reveals something important about 19th century heating. Cold followed people beyond the farmhouse. A church pew, carriage seat, workroom, and bedroom could all require warmth to be carried in a small container. The problem was often the distance between a fire and the human body. Portable heat shortened that distance. Even the best small warmer had limits. Its temperature began falling as soon as it left the stove room. A delay while children changed clothes or a conversation at the bedroom door reduced its usefulness. The warmer had to arrive at the right moment. Too early and it cooled before bedtime. Too late and the person waiting beside the bed began reconsidering every decision that had led to winter. Timing turned bed preparation into another household skill. The coverings were lifted. The warming object moved through the sheets. Nightclothes had already been placed nearby. The sleeper undressed quickly, climbed in, and pulled the layers closed before the temporary heat escaped. Once the body entered, the tool's work was nearly over. It had helped the sleeper cross the first cold threshold. After that, blankets, quilts, clothing, and trapped air had to preserve heat generated by the body. A room loses heat through walls, windows, roof, floor, cracks, and moving air. A bed reduces the problem to a much smaller enclosure. The coverings sit close to the skin. Every breath and movement adds a little warmth. Another sleeper adds more. The farmhouse could fail to maintain a comfortable bedroom and still create a tolerable sleeping space. That was the practical victory. Yet even this small victory was distributed by household decision. A family might own one warming pan, but several beds. Someone had to decide which bed received it first. A young child, an older relative, a guest, or a sick person might be given priority. Or the best tool might follow household rank rather than need. One object moving from room to room could reveal the entire family structure. The person carrying it also performed labour that disappeared once the bed felt warm. Coals had to be selected. The pan had to be handled safely. Water had to be heated. Bricks had to be wrapped. Cloth covers had to be repaired. The device had to be emptied and returned. A warm bed looked effortless only after the person preparing it had left the room. This labour often joined a longer chain of evening tasks: cooking, washing, tending children, drying clothes, banking the fire, and setting out morning garments. Bed warming was not a charming extra. In severe weather, it could be the final step that made sleep possible. The method also had to match the sleeper. A baby, older person, or someone who was ill might be more vulnerable to burns as well as cold. A warming object could not simply be placed against skin and forgotten. Cloth layers, position, and supervision mattered. Useful heat always required care. By the time the family settled, the warming pan had been removed. A brick or water vessel remained only if considered safe. Bed curtains, where a household possessed them, might be drawn. Caps and stockings stayed on. Blankets rose around shoulders. The small store of transferred heat began blending with body warmth. Outside the bed, the room remained cold enough to punish any exposed hand. Inside, the sheets no longer felt hostile. The difference might be only a few inches of cloth, but those inches separated sleep from hours of discomfort. Soon, the warming object itself began to cool. The rest of the night now depended on what surrounded the body. Wool, layered quilts, nightclothes, curtains, shared warmth, and the ability of trapped air to hold what the farmhouse could no longer replace. The tool had opened the door to comfort. The bedding had to keep that door from closing. A warm brick could help for 20 minutes. A warming pan could take the bite out of the sheets. Once the borrowed heat faded, the bed depended on layers, trapped air, and the body itself. The first useful layer was whatever sat closest to the sleeper. Nightshirts, shifts, stockings, caps, and other garments varied by region, household, wealth, and period. But the principle was plain. Clothing reduced the amount of skin exposed to cold air and slowed the loss of body heat when someone moved beneath the blankets. A nightcap was not merely a comic object from an old illustration. The head and ears remained exposed above the coverings unless something protected them. A cap also made the first cold minutes after entering bed less severe, especially when the room offered almost no warmth. Above the clothing came the bedding itself. Wool blankets were valuable because wool could trap air, provide warmth, and remain useful under conditions that made lighter materials less effective. Quilts added more layers. Their exact construction differed according to available fabric, skill, income, and local practice. A Pennsylvania quilt, now preserved by the Smithsonian, dated broadly between 1850 and 1899, makes the practical purpose visible. Its blocks combine wool and wool-cotton fabrics, and the whole piece is lined with a woven plaid wool blanket. It was made as a bed covering for warmth. The object is also full of small evidence. One edge has a later cotton strip, an initial is embroidered in the lining. Different fabrics were brought together into one heavy covering. The quilt was useful because material, stitching, repair, and reuse had accumulated inside it. The sleeper created the heat. The layers slowed its escape. A person climbs in. The sheets are no longer painfully cold because they have been warmed. The blankets are pulled over the shoulders. At first, the body still feels the difference between warm skin and cool fabric. Then, the narrow space under the coverings begins to change. Air trapped among fibres warms. The mattress beneath the body warms slowly. Clothing holds another thin layer. The space inside the bed becomes a small climate that belongs to the sleeper rather than the room. Outside that climate, a wash pitcher might be bitterly cold. Inside it, the toes finally relax. This was why gaps mattered. A blanket pulled away from the feet released warm air. An uncovered shoulder cooled quickly. A sleeper who moved constantly disturbed the small pocket everyone had worked to create. Two people sharing a bed added complexity, but they also added heat. Shared sleeping arrangements varied widely and cannot be reduced to the idea that every 19th century family crowded into one bed. Yet where beds, rooms, bedding, or fuel were limited, sharing could be practical. Children might sleep together, siblings might occupy one bed. Married couples shared warmth as well as space. Guests or relatives could alter the arrangement. Another body produced heat continuously. It also stole blankets with impressive historical consistency. The advantage was strongest when the coverings fit closely around both sleepers. More body heat entered the same enclosed space. The bed warmed faster and stayed more stable. But shared warmth came at the cost of privacy, comfort, and control. One person shifted, another woke. Someone's feet were cold. Someone else occupied more than the agreed territory. The physical solution to winter created a social negotiation that repeated every night. Curtained beds could make that enclosed climate more effective. Where a household owned a bed with curtains or added fabric around the sleeping space, the cloth could reduce moving air around the bed. It did not turn the bed into a heated room, but it created another boundary between the sleeper and the colder air beyond. Curtains also provided privacy in crowded rooms that made them both a thermal and social object. Draw the fabric and the bed became a room within a room. The phrase sounds luxurious until the outer room is cold enough to make the inner one necessary. Bed curtains, however, should not be imagined in every farmhouse. They required a suitable bed, material, space, and household means. Simpler households relied more heavily on clothing, blankets, quilts, shared sleeping space, and the placement of the bed itself. Location could matter almost as much as fabric. A bed near an outside wall might be colder. One near a chimney or above the main stove room could receive some benefit from heat below or warmed masonry, depending on the structure. A bed directly in a draft remained difficult, no matter how handsome the quilt looked. Families learned the cold paths inside their own houses. They knew which window leaked air. They knew which wall felt damp or sharp in winter. They knew which side of the bed became unpleasant when the wind changed. A bed might be shifted, a curtain added, or cloth placed where air entered. The adjustment was small. The difference at midnight could be enormous. Mattress materials also shaped comfort. Straw, feathers, wool, fibre, or other fillings appeared in different combinations depending on region and means. A feather bed could provide softness and insulation, but feathers were valuable and not universal. Straw bedding was more accessible in farming areas, but required maintenance and replacement. Whatever lay beneath the sleeper needed to insulate the body from the bed frame and the cold air below. A person could have several blankets above and still lose warmth through a thin layer beneath. The bed had to defend every border. Moisture complicated that defence. Damp clothing, humid bedding, or condensation made cold feel worse and could reduce comfort. Drying garments near the stove before bedtime mattered, because carrying moisture into the sleeping space meant asking body heat to solve another problem. So the evening routine returned again. Stockings drying, quilts aired when conditions allowed, bedding checked, damp items kept away, and the warmest available layers assigned where they seemed most necessary. That final phrase, most necessary, could hide a difficult decision. A household might own one especially heavy quilt and several beds. One room might have a feather bed while another had straw. One sleeper might receive a warmed brick. Another might be expected to manage with extra clothing. The objects did not distribute themselves. Someone decided. Need could guide the decision. A baby, an older person, or someone ill might receive greater protection. Household affection could guide it. Custom could guide it. Rank, authority, gender, age, guest status, or simple possession could guide it as well. The warmest bed in the farmhouse was not always occupied by the coldest person. That is where the bedding stops being only a story about domestic ingenuity. It becomes evidence. A quilt can reveal sewing skill and material reuse. A bed curtain can reveal privacy and means. A shared mattress can reveal practical adaptation. Together, these objects also show who had access to fabric, space, labour, and choice. Late in the night, the fire downstairs continued to weaken. The warming pan was cold. The brick at the foot of the bed had lost most of its heat. What remained came from bodies held inside layers built and arranged by human hands. For one sleeper, those layers might be thick, dry, and carefully prepared. For another person under the same roof, winter might be only one thin blanket away. And that difference is where the farmhouse's heating system begins to reveal who the household believed should be comfortable first. The answer was rarely written down, but it appeared in the rooms. The best bed did not always belong to the person who felt the cold most sharply. It often belonged to the person whose place in the household carried the most authority, the most respect, or the clearest claim to privacy. That claim could come from age, ownership, marriage, illness, guest status, or family custom. It could also come from something less generous. Rank. A farmhouse at night became a map of relationships. Picture the last heavy quilt being carried into a guest room. A child who normally slept there is moved to a sibling's bed. Across the hall, a hired worker continues up another flight or ladder toward a loft where the roof boards meet the wind. 3 people have changed places, and the stove downstairs has not moved at all. The exact arrangement varied too much to become one rule. The pattern was still visible. Heat followed permission. The owners of the house might occupy the most protected bedroom. An older parent could be placed near the warmest room if the family had the space and means. A guest might receive the better bed because hospitality required it, even if children were moved elsewhere. A hired hand might sleep in a loft, attic, back room, or separate building where the warmth of the main stove barely arrived. A child did not usually choose the room. A farm worker did not rearrange the household because a wall was drafty. A younger relative did not always claim the heaviest quilt simply because it was cold. The people with the least authority often had the least control over where they slept, what bedding they received, or how close they remained to the fire. Cold made hierarchy physical. At the supper table, rank could be hidden beneath conversation. At midnight, it appeared in the distance between a mattress and the stove. Consider a household with one heated main room and several sleeping spaces. The person in the chamber above the kitchen may receive some warmth rising through the floor or chimney area. Another person sleeps farther away, under the roof, where wind presses against thin boards. Both can truthfully say they slept in the same farmhouse. They did not sleep in the same winter. Houses were limited, beds were expensive, and large families balanced illness, age, propriety, work schedules, and guests. Necessity complicated the choices without making their effects equal. The important point is that warmth was not distributed by weather alone. People distributed it. The same was true of bedding. One heavy wool quilt might be assigned to the room judged most important. A feather bed could remain with the household heads. Children might share blankets. A worker might use bedding supplied as part of employment, with quality depending on the farm, the employer, and the worker's bargaining position. A blanket becomes a social document when there are not enough blankets. Even shared sleeping offered different meanings depending on who had a choice. Siblings sharing a bed might gain warmth and companionship. A servant, worker, or dependent sharing space, because no private room was available, experienced the same arrangement with less control. Privacy and warmth were both resources. The household traded one against the other. Closing bed curtains could provide a warmer pocket and a little separation, but only for the person whose bed had curtains. Moving several children into one room concentrated body heat, but it also concentrated noise, illness, and disturbance. Allowing someone to sleep near the kitchen improved warmth, while placing that person inside the busiest domestic space. Every solution charged something. The person who received the warmest position did not always perform the most heating labour either. Someone else might have cut the wood, carried it indoors, cleared ash, dried bedding, warmed the pan, repaired the quilt, and checked the stove. By the time the favoured sleeper entered the bed, the labour had disappeared into comfort. That disappearance is one of the central tricks of household history. The finished room looks calm. The work required to make it calm has already left the frame. Women often carried a large share of domestic fire management, cooking, clothing care, bedding preparation, and childcare in many 19th century farm households, while men and older boys frequently performed much of the heavy cutting and hauling. But real households did not always divide work cleanly. Widows cut fuel, girls carried wood, hired men tended stoves, boys watched younger children. Illness and absence rearranged expectations overnight. The safer claim is not that one gender always did one task. It is that warmth required a chain of labour, and some links were valued more visibly than others. A man cutting wood could point to the pile, a woman keeping children clothed, drying stockings, adjusting bedding, managing the evening fire, and waking to a cold room left behind fewer dramatic objects. The evidence survives unevenly because an axe appears heroic in family memory more easily than a repaired seam. Yet a torn blanket could ruin the work of the axe. So could a damp mattress. So could a child left uncovered after kicking away the quilt? The heating system continued after everyone entered bed. Someone noticed who coughed. Someone adjusted a covering. Someone responded when a child woke cold. Someone might rise to check the fire, depending on the household and conditions. Sleep itself could become another form of supervision. This was especially true when a family member was ill, very young, elderly, or physically vulnerable. Such a person might receive the warmest available space, but the care required still fell on another body. One person remained warm because another person woke. Comfort moved through dependency. That fact changes the meaning of the entire farmhouse night. At first, the story seems to be about clever objects. A stove, a warming pan, a quilt, a brick wrapped in cloth. Then the objects begin pointing toward people. Who bought the stove? Who fed it? Who owned the bed? Who made the quilt? Who decided where the worker slept? Who rose first when the fire went out? The heating system was a household system because every answer involved a relationship. Even the phrase, "the family stayed warm," becomes too smooth. Which family member? Warm compared with whom? Near which wall? Under how many layers? After whose labour? The record makes these distinctions difficult. Manuals describe ideals. Memoirs soften hardship. And employers recorded wages more often than workers recorded cold nights. The silence is not proof that discomfort was absent. It is evidence that discomfort was ordinary enough to go unrecorded, or belong to people whose voices did not survive. Objects sometimes speak more clearly. A worn quilt shows repair. A small room shows crowding. A stove placed in one central space shows where heat was expected to gather. A loft reached by a narrow stair shows how far some sleepers remained from the fire. None of these objects tells us exactly what one person felt at 2 a.m. Together, they tell us that the farmhouse did not offer one shared level of comfort. It offered positions within a system. By the middle of the night, those positions became harder to ignore. The owners remained beneath heavier coverings. Children shifted against one another. A worker in an upper room pulled a coat over the blanket. Downstairs, the stove released the last heat purchased by the day's labour. The cold outside was equal. The protection inside was not. And once we understand that, the next question is no longer simply who received the warmest bed. It is who performed the repeated, mostly invisible work that allowed any bed in the house to become warm at all. The work rarely belonged to one person from beginning to end. It moved through the household in pieces. One person might cut the wood. A child carried smaller pieces into the wood box. The person nearest the stove kept it supplied while supper cooked. An older daughter turned damp stockings. The sleeper beside the youngest child pulled a quilt back into place after midnight. Before dawn, the first adult awake began the fire again. By bedtime, all of those actions had disappeared into the appearance of an ordinary night. That is the first difficulty in seeing domestic labour clearly. When it succeeds, nothing dramatic happens. The fire burns, the blanket holds, the child sleeps. The boots are dry enough by morning. Success looks like silence. Failure leaves a better record. A chimney fire, a scorched sheet, or a household running short of wood might be remembered because it interrupted routine. The thousands of evenings when a problem was noticed early and prevented often vanished from memory. The warm farmhouse was built from avoided disasters. In many 19th century farming households, heavy outdoor fuel work often fell to men and older boys. Trees had to be felled, logs sectioned, wood split, and loads moved over ground. That labour was visible. It left stumps, piles, tools, and sore shoulders. Inside, women frequently carried much of the daily work that converted fuel into usable comfort. They cooked over the same heat source that warmed the room. They managed kettles, clothing, bedding, children, and the timing of evening tasks. They noticed when a blanket needed repair, when a stocking was still wet, when a baby required another layer, or when the stove needed attention after others began thinking about sleep. But this division was never perfect or universal. A widow might cut her own wood. A daughter might carry fuel while an injured brother recovered. A hired man could feed the kitchen stove before dawn. An older boy might tend younger children. A farm woman working outdoors all day still returned to tasks waiting inside. Winter simply added work until somebody performed it. Consider the wood box beside the stove. It looks like storage. In practice, it is evidence of repeated carrying. Every piece inside crossed the yard in somebody's arms. Bark caught on sleeves. Snow melted onto the floor. Splinters entered fingers. The box emptied slowly, then suddenly, usually when the person nearest it had just become comfortable. Nothing makes a household heating system more democratic than an empty wood box. Somebody had to stand up. The same was true of water. Warm water for washing, food, or a bed-warming vessel had to be heated, moved, and protected from cooling. A kettle did not fill itself. Water might come from a pump, well, cistern, spring, or another source. In severe weather, even reaching it could become unpleasant work. The warm object at the foot of the bed carried more than heat. It carried water, fuel, lifting, waiting, and attention. Clothing created another chain. A coat returned damp from snow. Mittens absorbed sweat. Stockings collected mud and moisture. These items had to be hung, turned, shifted, and watched near the stove. Too far away and they remained wet. Too close and they scorched or became dangerous. Drying clothing was an evening of small corrections. The person nearest the stove moved a mitten. A boot was checked. One garment gave up the warmest position because another needed it more. The stove room became a crowded negotiation between fabric and flame. And honestly, the fabric was not always winning. Bedding required similar maintenance. A quilt could last for years, but not without repair. Seams loosened, fabric wore thin, filling shifted, a blanket edge frayed. These problems mattered because every opening allowed warmth to escape, and every weakened area threatened the useful life of an expensive object. A hand sewing by limited evening light was repairing insulation. The needle moved through cloth. Thread pulled tight. Nearby, the stove clicked. A child leaned against the table. Outside, wind pressed against the wall. Nothing in that scene resembles an emergency. Yet the repair might decide whether someone slept comfortably in the next cold spell. Children added another layer because children rarely remained arranged. A child placed beneath a quilt could kick it away. A cap came loose. One small body shifted across the bed and opened a gap along the blanket edge. The sleeper beside the child woke, reached through darkness, pulled the covering back into place, and settled again. No household ledger listed prevented child from becoming cold at 2 a.m. The labour existed anyway. Care work made warmth continuous. Without it, the heating system ended when the adults climbed into bed. Older or ill family members could require the same attention. A person recovering from sickness might need warmer bedding, a heated drink, closer monitoring, or a position nearer the fire. That care consumed fuel and time, but it also consumed sleep. One person's protected night could be another person's interrupted one. This is why comfort cannot be measured only by who had the heaviest blanket. We must also ask who remained alert after the room went dark. Even the fire could demand nighttime attention, depending on the household, weather, stove, fuel, and risk. The responsible adult might rise to check it. Leaving a warm bed meant crossing cold floorboards, descending into a cooling room, and opening the stove. The iron door gave a brief orange light. A poker disturbed the fuel. Air entered. Sparks shifted. A log was added if needed. Then the person returned upstairs carrying cold in their clothing. The fire had been preserved. Sleep had not. Morning made the hidden chain visible again. The first person out of bed met the coldest version of the house. Blankets were lifted. Warm air escaped. Feet touched the floor. Clothing went on quickly. The stove had to be inspected before breakfast, before washing, before the room became useful. If an ember survived, it had to be found and encouraged. If none remained, the fire had to be built from the beginning. Kindling came first, then small fuel, then larger pieces. The draught was managed. Smoke was watched. A kettle was placed. The room waited. The day could not properly begin until heat returned. This first labour often happened while others remained in bed, making the warm room appear almost natural. They came downstairs after the fire caught. The kettle had begun to murmur. Light entered the windows. The farmhouse seemed to be waking by itself. It was not. Somebody had woken it. The identity of that person varied. In one household, it might be the farmer preparing for chores. In another, the woman responsible for breakfast and domestic work. A hired worker, older child, or relative could be first. Season, illness, age, and local custom shaped the routine. Warmth required a first person. That person paid the morning cost before anyone else received the benefit. By daylight, the heating system again looked like a stove, a chimney, and a pile of wood. Its true machinery was human. Hands cut, carried, patched, dried, lifted, stirred, checked, and covered. Bodies lost sleep so other bodies could remain warm. Knowledge passed through repeated practice. How the stove sounded, where the draught entered, which child threw off blankets, which log burned slowly, and how long a wrapped brick remained safe. This knowledge was not secondary to the heating system. It completed the heating system. And once that becomes clear, the next layer of the farmhouse night is impossible to avoid. The people doing this work did not all receive the same room, the same bed, the same privacy, or the same protection in return. The sleeping arrangement made the inequality visible. A farmhouse might contain one household, but it did not contain one kind of night. The room nearest the stove, the chamber above the kitchen, the bed against an interior wall, and the loft beneath the roof could belong to the same building while offering different protection from cold. Who slept where depended on the house, the season, family size, age, gender, illness, employment, custom, and authority. There was no universal farmhouse floor plan and no single rule followed across the century. Still, the pattern matters. The people with the greatest control over the household usually had the greatest control over sleeping space. The husband and wife who owned or managed the farm might occupy the principal bedroom. An elderly parent could be given a protected room if age, affection, or authority made that possible. A guest might receive the better bed because hospitality carried obligations. Children could be moved, grouped, or asked to share. The coldest room often belonged to the person least able to object. That person might be a hired hand, a younger relative, an older child, or someone whose place in the household depended on work rather than ownership. A farm worker could sleep in an attic, loft, back room, or separate building depending on region and farm size. Some arrangements were decent, others were bare. A bed, blanket, chest, and hook for clothing could be considered sufficient, even if the room received almost none of the main stove's heat. The worker still had to rise early. That is one of winter's less charming efficiencies. The person farthest from the fire might be the first person expected outside. Imagine a hired man in a low upper room. Wind moves along the roof boards. His coat lies across the foot of the bed, not because the room is fashionable, but because the blanket is thin. Before dawn, he pulls on clothing that has cooled beside him, descends into darkness, and crosses the yard toward the animals. His sleeping place has already told us his position. He receives shelter, but not first claim on comfort. Now move to the guest room. The heaviest quilt has been placed there. The sheets were warmed. A child who normally used the room sleeps tonight beside a sibling. The guest may never see the exchange. Hospitality presents the finished bed, not the rearrangement behind it. Comfort moved from one person to another with better manners. Children occupied another uncertain place in the heat map. Very young children might remain close to parents for care and warmth. Older siblings could share a room or bed. A large household might place several children together because there were fewer beds than bodies, because privacy was limited, or because shared warmth was practical. The arrangement could feel safe and familiar. It could also mean elbows, cold feet, whispered arguments, and one child somehow owning every blanket by 2 in the morning. The physics was useful. The diplomacy was unfinished. Children did not usually decide when a better quilt moved to a guest room, or when a sibling joined the bed. Their sleeping space changed according to adult priorities. If an ill relative needed warmth, the room might be rearranged. If visitors arrived, children could be displaced. A household used flexible bodies to solve inflexible architecture. Older family members might receive special consideration, but that too depended on resources and relationships. A grandparent could sleep near the main room or in a bed placed where care was easier. Another older relative might remain in a colder space because the household simply lacked alternatives. Need did not automatically create capacity. A family could understand that someone required more warmth and still have no extra stove, room, or heavy blanket to provide it. Illness made these limits more severe. A sick person might be moved closer to heat, given extra coverings, or watched through the night. That meant another person lost space, fuel, or sleep. The warmest available room could become a temporary sick room, forcing normal work and family life to bend around the bed. One body's vulnerability reorganized the house. Privacy followed the same uneven pattern. A private bedroom required enough rooms, enough beds, and enough fuel or bedding to make separation practical. Poorer or larger households had fewer choices. People slept near relatives, workers, children, or guests because the building demanded it. Sharing space could reduce heat loss and increase safety. It also meant being watched, heard, and interrupted. A curtained bed offered some separation where one existed, but even that privacy belonged to the people who owned the bed and the fabric around it. Others changed clothes beside a shared mattress, behind a door that did not latch well, or in a room where another person was already trying to sleep. Cold compressed social distance. It made privacy expensive. Gender and propriety also shaped arrangements, especially as children grew older or unrelated people shared a household. Families balanced warmth against expectations about who could sleep together or occupy the same room. Those expectations differed by time, place, religion, class, and household. They could never be reduced to one tidy diagram, but the balancing act itself was real. Move people together and conserve warmth. Separate them and preserve privacy. The house rarely provided enough space to maximize both. Bed quality made the hierarchy even clearer. A principal bed might have a better mattress, heavier curtains, stronger frame, or thicker coverings. Another could use straw filling that needed renewal. A worker's bedding might be supplied as part of employment. A child's bed could be assembled from what remained available. The same household might own an impressive quilt and a badly worn blanket. Objects followed status as often as need. This does not mean every farmhouse was ruled by cold-hearted selfishness. Families made sacrifices. Parents gave blankets to children. Siblings shared. Workers could be treated with genuine care. Guests sometimes refused the better bed. Affection complicated rank, but kindness operated inside material limits. There were only so many rooms, only so many coverings, only so much fuel. When the temperature fell, those limits became decisions. Even the order of waking reflected the sleeping map. Someone near the kitchen might reach the stove quickly. Someone in the loft faced a longer path through cold air. A child beneath heavy quilts could remain in bed, while an adult dressed in darkness. A hired hand could leave before the household room warmed. The house did not protect everyone for the same number of hours. That is why the question, how did farmhouses stay warm, has to be answered carefully. People inside the same structure received different amounts of warmth, according to location, bedding, labour, need, and authority. A person near the stove enjoyed residual heat. A person in the attic relied on clothing and blankets. A person sharing a bed borrowed warmth from another body. A person rising first surrendered the warmth already earned. By the deepest part of the night, the house became almost still. Beds held small pockets of human heat. Doors remained closed. The stove downstairs faded toward embers. Then the wind changed. Air pressed against a window frame. A pipe clicked. Somewhere below, a piece of fuel shifted inside the stove. The same fire that created the household's most valuable comfort was still burning inside a structure built largely from wood, surrounded by cloth, ash, soot, dry kindling, and sleeping people. Keeping winter outside had brought another danger into the centre of the house. And unlike the cold, fire did not always wait for morning. The danger began with the fact that fire had to remain close to everything it could destroy. A stove sat on a floor surrounded by wood, cloth, baskets, paper, bedding, and clothing hung nearby to dry. Kindling waited within reach, ash collected below. A pipe carried smoke toward the chimney. The arrangement was practical because the heat source belonged at the centre of domestic life. It was also full of opportunities for error. Begin with the final stove check. The last person in the room turns a damp garment away from the iron. A basket of kindling is pulled back. The stove door is tested. The draft is adjusted. An ash bucket is left where no stray ember can reach wood or cloth. For a moment, the person stands still and listens. A faint tick comes from the pipe. There is no visible problem. The sound may be ordinary contraction, fuel shifting, or the small noises of hot metal. Familiarity allows the person to judge what belongs and what does not. That judgment is part of the safety equipment. A spark could escape when the stove door opened. A coal could fall during refueling. A warming pan could scorch a sheet. A garment moved too close to iron might begin to smoulder. A child could stumble against a hot surface. A scorched floorboard or a room filling with smoke could undo the household's work before anyone reached bed. The open hearth made some dangers visible. Flames moved in front of the household. Sparks rose. Burning wood shifted. A log could roll if it was poorly placed. Stone or brick around the hearth reduced risk, but fire still occupied an open space inside the house. People used screens, tools, judgment, and habit to manage it. They learned how far cloth should remain from flame, how to place fuel, and when a fire needed attention. At Fort Scott, interpretations of open hearth cooking emphasized that a useful fire was something to be studied and controlled. The cook rose early to begin it and tended it last at night, banking coals for morning. That routine was partly about efficiency and partly about keeping a difficult tool within understood limits. Familiarity did not make fire harmless. It made warning signs easier to recognize. An enclosed stove reduced some open flame exposure, but it introduced its own risks. The iron body could become hot enough to burn skin or ignite material pressed against it. Stove doors and draft controls had to close properly. Pipes needed sound connections. A damaged pipe could allow heat or smoke into the wrong place. The stove was safer only when the entire system behaved. That system included the chimney. A chimney had to create enough draft to carry smoke and gases out of the house. Wind, construction, blockage, soot, and the condition of the flue could affect how well it worked. When the draft weakened, smoke might spill into the room after the stove door opened. The family noticed through smell first. Then eyes watered. Someone adjusted the fire, opened a door or window, or checked the pipe. The solution might remove smoke, but it also released warmth into the night. Heating the house and ventilating it could become opposite tasks performed within the same minute. Soot and creosote created a slower danger. Deposits could accumulate inside a chimney or pipe, especially where fires burned cool or fuel was damp. If those deposits ignited, the chimney itself could become intensely hot. Maintenance reduced the risk, though practice varied. Chimneys had to be inspected and cleaned. Pipes had to be watched for gaps or damage. Ash had to be removed without carrying hidden embers into a place where they could begin another fire. A bucket of grey ash looked finished. It was not always finished. An ember could remain alive beneath the surface for hours. Put ash into a wooden box, leave it near a wall, or empty it where dry material waited, and the waste from yesterday's fire could become tomorrow's emergency. Metal containers and careful placement helped. The safer habit was to treat dull ash as potentially alive. Night increased every risk because attention decreased. During the evening, someone heard the stove, saw the flame, and noticed smoke. After the house went quiet, the fire continued without an audience. Family members trusted the stove, chimney, fuel arrangement, and final check. They also needed sleep. This created the same conflict that appeared throughout the heating system. Preserve enough fire to make morning easier, but not so much that the house remained dangerously hot or fuel burned too quickly. Restrict airflow enough to slow combustion, but not in a way that produced poor burning or smoke. There was no perfect setting that worked for every stove and every night. Weather could change. Wind altered draft. A larger log behaved differently from a smaller one. Fuel that seemed dry could burn poorly. A chimney that worked well most nights could respond badly under unusual conditions. Experience reduced uncertainty. It never removed it. Incomplete combustion and poor ventilation could also produce dangerous gases. Rural households did not understand carbon monoxide in the modern technical way and did not have detectors waiting on the wall. Their protection depended on functioning chimneys, visible smoke, practical knowledge, fresh air, and sometimes luck. The absence of an alarm did not prove the air was safe. Combustion depended on ventilation and sound equipment, while households had few ways to detect invisible failure. Children faced a more obvious threat. A toddler did not understand why a stove could not be touched. Adults placed guards where possible, gave warnings, and built habits around the hot object. Still, the stove occupied the room where children played, adults worked, and clothing dried. It lived among them. The danger was also unequal. The person tending the fire faced the stove most often. The person carrying ash handled hidden embers. The person warming beds worked with hot coals near cloth. The person rising first entered the cooling room before anyone else could notice a problem. Risk followed labour just as warmth did. A worker sleeping in an attic might be farther from the stove's heat, but closer to a chimney passing through the roof. A child beside the kitchen gained warmth while living near hot iron. A person cooking for hours received more radiant heat and more smoke exposure than someone entering only for supper. Comfort and danger occupied the same locations. The household built routines around that contradiction. Material moved away from the stove. The door was checked. Ash was placed safely. The warming pan was emptied. And the final adult listened once more before leaving. Morning brought another inspection of smoke, pipe, chimney, ash, and any surviving ember. Most mornings began without disaster. That ordinary success can make the danger disappear from later memory. Family stories preserved the warm kitchen, the quilt, and the snow outside. They are less likely to preserve every time a sleeve was moved away from iron, or ash was carried carefully into the yard. Nostalgia remembers the glow. Routine absorbed the fear. And this creates a problem for anyone reconstructing the farmhouse night. The objects survive. The stove remains in a museum. The warming pan can be measured. The quilt can be examined. But the vigilance around them, the smell that caused someone to wake, the scorched mark that changed a habit, the cold room accepted because another fire seemed too risky, often survives only in fragments. To understand the night honestly, we have to look not only at what the records preserve, but at what ordinary people had little reason, time, or power to record. The first problem is that the people who left the clearest records were not always the people who spent the coldest nights. A farmhouse rarely preserved its own temperature. No wall wrote down how sharply the air changed after midnight. No floorboard recorded which child crossed it barefoot. No quilt explained whether it belonged to the household heads, a guest, or the hired worker upstairs. What survives is uneven. There are houses, stoves, warming pans, patent drawings, quilts, letters, diaries, household manuals, advertisements, and later, memories. Each source can answer part of the question. None can recreate every winter night. An object tells us what was possible. The Bell No. 18 cast iron stove shows a compact heating body, a pipe opening, a vent, a removable cooking surface, and repairs made during its working life. It proves that this type of stove existed and that people maintained it. The object cannot tell us whether a particular family could afford enough dry fuel. It does not identify the person who rose before dawn to light it. It does not explain who remained cold in the next room. A warming pan offers the same kind of evidence. Its metal body, pierced lid, and long handle show how heat could be carried between sheets. A surviving example can be dated, measured, and studied. It cannot prove that every farmhouse owned one. Museum objects often survive because someone considered them worth keeping. Better-made objects are more likely to endure than improvised ones. A carefully worked copper warming pan may enter a collection. A cracked brick wrapped in old cloth usually returns to the earth without completing any paperwork. History has always been slightly biased toward objects with handles. This does not make museum collections misleading. It means we must ask what kind of household could buy, inherit, preserve, or donate the object we are seeing. The Pennsylvania wool quilt offers another example. Its blanket lining, mixed fabrics, added edge strip, and embroidered initial show warmth, repair, reuse, and ownership in one surviving object. Yet the maker is unknown. The quilt has outlived the hands that assembled it. The record preserves the stitching more clearly than the person. Patents create another tempting source. The 19th century foot warmer models preserved by the Smithsonian are wonderfully specific. George Thatcher's 1847 water foot stove, Nathaniel Waterman's 1855 hot water models, and the 1865 Philadelphia box, heated by water or sand, all show inventors attacking the same problem through different mechanisms. A patent tells us that an idea was described and legally claimed. It does not tell us how many farm families bought it. An invention could exist without reaching many homes. It might be expensive, difficult to manufacture, regionally unavailable, or simply unpopular. The patents model records ambition more clearly than adoption. Advertisements can exaggerate even more cheerfully. A stove manufacturer wanted buyers to believe that a new model burned less fuel, held heat longer, cooked more evenly, smoked less, and perhaps improved the moral atmosphere of the entire household before breakfast. The claims reveal what consumers worried about. They do not always reveal what the product achieved. Household manuals are useful because they preserve advice about fuel, cleaning, ventilation, bedding, clothing, and domestic order. They show what authors believed a well-managed home should do. The dangerous word is should. Advice literature often describes an ideal household with enough time, material, discipline, and authority to follow the instructions. A poor family with limited fuel, a sick parent, 6 children, and a leaking roof may have understood the advice perfectly and still been unable to obey it. A manual can record expectations more clearly than reality. Diaries and letters seem more personal, but they carry their own limits. The writer needed literacy, paper, time, and a reason to describe the cold. A routine discomfort might be mentioned only when it became unusual. A farm woman could spend hours managing the stove and write one sentence about the weather because the work itself seemed too ordinary to explain. A hired worker might leave no written account at all. Children rarely controlled the family archive. People who could not write appear through the observations of people who could, and those observers did not always consider their labour, fear, or discomfort important. Even language changes what we see. A diary entry saying the night was very cold does not give us a bedroom temperature. One person's severe cold could be another person's normal winter. A later memoir describing a cosy kitchen may preserve genuine affection while forgetting the attic, the smoke, or the person who carried the wood. Memory keeps emotional truth and rearranges physical detail. That is especially important when old farmhouse life becomes nostalgia. The glowing stove, thick quilt, snow-covered window, and family gathered together form a powerful image. None of those details has to be false. The room could be warm. The quilt could be beautiful. The family could remember the evening with love. But the camera angle matters. Move beyond the stove's radius and the room changes. Follow the person carrying ash. Open the upstairs door. Ask where the hired hand slept. Ask how much wood remained in March. The cosy image is incomplete. Architecture helps fill some gaps. The placement of a chimney, stove connection, staircase, bedroom, loft, and exterior wall shows how heat might have moved. The Hoover birthplace cottage in Iowa gives us a particularly clear two-room example. One combined living, cooking, and dining room heated by a cook stove, and one bedroom used by 5 people. Still, a surviving building may have been altered. Stoves were replaced, walls moved, windows changed, insulation added. A house interpreted for visitors may be cleaner, safer, and more complete than it was during ordinary use. Restoration can preserve a building while accidentally improving its manners. Archaeology provides fragments, nails, glass, ceramics, stove parts, ash deposits, building foundations, and evidence of repair. These materials help establish how people lived and what they owned. They rarely tell us who complained. A broken stoveplate proves damage. It does not tell us whether the family repaired it immediately, endured smoke for weeks, borrowed another device, or abandoned the room. The silence around the object must remain silence unless another source fills it. This is why exact claims become dangerous. We cannot honestly say that every 1800s farmhouse bedroom froze each night. We cannot claim that all families shared beds, banked fires in the same way, used hot bricks, or followed one division of labour. Climate, decade, architecture, wealth, fuel, and household structure change the answer. The stronger statement is also more useful. Across many rural households, heat remained local, labour-intensive, and unevenly distributed. Families used combinations of fire, stoves, clothing, bedding, room management, and portable warmth according to what they possessed. The evidence supports a pattern, not one universal scene. Careful uncertainty protects the people inside the story from being turned into costumes. They were not a single group called the Pioneers or the Victorians shivering in identical houses. They were owners and tenants, workers and children, widows and married couples, prosperous farmers and families one failed harvest away from shortage. Their nights differed. The surviving sources differ too. So when we picture the farmhouse after midnight, we should hold the image lightly. A stove cooling, bedding drawn close, someone far from the heat, and a record that preserves the object more clearly than the person using it. The evidence may not give us every temperature. It does show why new heating technology kept arriving, why old methods remained beside it, and why the 19th century did not experience one unchanging farmhouse winter. The next improvement would promise more control. Whether ordinary households could obtain it was another question. More control arrived slowly, unevenly, and usually with a price attached. Picture one northern farmhouse changing across several decades. This is not a single documented family in every detail. It is a sequence built from changes that occurred in many American homes. Early in the century, the kitchen still turns around an open hearth. The cook rises before the rest of the household, studies the coals, and rebuilds the useful fire. Pots hang at different heights. One vessel sits closer to the heat, another waits near the edge. The cook bends, lifts, turns, and judges. The hearth is inefficient as a room heater, but it is already part of the building. It has a chimney. The family understands it. Replacing it would require money, transport, and trust in a machine that many neighbours may not yet own. Then cast iron stoves begin appearing more often. Cookstoves were manufactured in the 1820s and 1830s, but early buyers were more likely to be prosperous households or large establishments. At Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania, the years from 1825 to 1844 were its most prosperous period, and cast-iron stoves made up much of its production. The furnace could cast the iron. That did not place a stove in every farmhouse. The object still had to travel. A merchant had to stock it. A family needed cash or credit. The room might need a floor plate, a chimney connection, or a new length of pipe. Somebody had to decide that the promised fuel savings justified the cost. In our imagined farmhouse, the stove finally arrives. It is heavy, black, and more complicated than the hearth it is supposed to improve. Men carry it through the door. The household watches the pipe fitted toward the chimney. The old cooking space has to be rearranged. The first fire is not a miracle. Smoke tests the joints. Iron gives off new smells. The cook discovers that the top is hotter in one place than another. A pot boils too quickly. The oven disappoints. A damper is moved, then moved back. The family has purchased control. Now it has to learn the controls. Over weeks, the stove becomes familiar. The cook stands more upright than at the hearth. Lighter pots can replace some heavier hearth equipment. The fire is enclosed. Heat radiates from several sides. A pot can remain on the cook surface while another dish uses the oven. The main room changes around the new machine. Chairs shift. Wet clothing claims a new drying zone. Children learn that dark iron can burn even when no flame is visible. The person tending the stove learns how the draft responds to wind and how quickly a certain size of wood disappears. The advertisement promised efficiency. Experience decides what that word means. The stove may use fuel more effectively than the open hearth. It still needs fuel. A better firebox does not fell trees, split logs, or carry coal from the nearest rail connection. In one region, wood remains the obvious choice because the family has access to timber. In another, coal becomes practical as transport networks grow. A multi-fuel stove is only flexible when more than one fuel can actually reach the household. The landscape continues entering the room. A generation passes. The old hearth remains in the wall, perhaps still used for certain tasks. The stove becomes the normal centre of cooking and heat. A daughter who watched the first difficult fires now manages the dampers by sound and habit. New devices appear in catalogues, patent records, shops, and conversation. In 1847, George Thatcher patents a water-heated foot stove in New York. In 1855, Nathaniel Waterman of Boston patents hot water warmers, including one intended for a bed. In 1859, James Maydole patents an oil lamp foot warmer. In 1865, inventors in Philadelphia offer a box warmed with hot water or sand, while Edwin Reynolds patents a kerosene-burning warmer for a carriage. The devices become more elaborate because the larger problem remains unsolved. Churches are cold. Carriages are cold. Bedrooms are cold. The heat source is still somewhere else. Our farmhouse might never own one of these patented models. Patent records prove invention, not adoption. The family may continue wrapping a brick because it is cheap, understood, and already present. New iron and old cloth share the same bed. Later in the century, the household sees another stove advertised. Perhaps it promises better draft, a larger oven, or lower fuel use. The compact Bell No. 18 type, made by the Richmond Stove Company, shows how manufacturers combined heating, cooking, vents, pipe connections, and decorative finish in one cast-iron object. At Pipe Spring in the Arizona Territory, a Chicago-made wood stove arrived in the late 1880s with a water reservoir and warming ovens. The old hearth remained behind it, and some cooking may still have continued there. That surviving kitchen gives us the century in one room. The hearth does not vanish the moment the stove arrives. The new machine stands in front of the old method. People use both when circumstances require it. The same overlap appears in bedding. A manufactured warmer may rest beneath a handmade quilt. Factory cloth joins reused fabric. Purchased coal heats water for a device carried into a room that still leaks around the window. Technological change did not replace one heating world with another. It stacked new iron, new patents, and new promises on top of old rooms that continued losing heat. By the later 19th century, Some rural homes benefited from tighter construction, improved windows, better stove designs, and a wider range of manufactured goods. Others remained in older buildings with familiar drafts and limited equipment. The date on the calendar did not determine the temperature of the room. A prosperous household in 1875 might own multiple stoves and substantial bedding. A poorer family nearby could rely on one aging cookstove. An isolated farmhouse might adopt new equipment years after an urban institution considered it ordinary. St. Elizabeth's Hospital had described central heating and ventilation in 1859. Arlington House had a central system installed in the 1850s. Those examples belong to large or wealthy settings with resources far beyond the ordinary 2-room or 4-room farm home. The farmhouse continued solving winter locally. A second stove could extend comfort into another room where a family could afford it. That second stove also needed another pipe, another supply of fuel, another round of ash removal, and another hot surface to supervise. Comfort expanded one stove at a time. The upstairs bedroom could remain cold. The wrapped brick could remain useful. The person rising first could still kneel before grey ash. This is why the story cannot end with the invention of a better stove. The machine improved. The house remained part of the problem. Walls leaked, doors opened, fuel ran low, and warmth still depended on human timing. By the end of the century, the farmhouse heating system might contain more iron, more manufactured objects, and more adjustable parts than it had decades earlier. Its success still depended on structure, fuel, labour, knowledge, and bodies working together. That combination is the real machine. Whenever one part failed, winter entered through the gap. Winter entered through the gap because the farmhouse was never one object fighting the cold. It was a collection of modest defences arranged to support one another. The roof slowed rain and snow. The walls reduced wind. Shutters and curtains interrupted moving air. The stove turned fuel into heat. Clothing kept warmth near the skin. Bedding held it through the night. Doors decided which rooms remained active. Human judgment connected every part. Remove one piece, and the others had to work harder. A thin wall demanded more fuel. Damp wood demanded more patience. A weak chimney demanded more attention. Poor bedding demanded more body heat. A large room demanded more from the stove. A sick person demanded more from the household. The system often failed by increasing the burden somewhere else. This is what made the farmhouse a winter machine. Though it looked nothing like a machine in the modern sense, there was no central control panel. No single person could adjust the whole building with one movement. The controls were scattered. An axe in the yard controlled the future wood supply. A stove draft controlled the speed of burning. A door latch controlled how much cold air entered the main room. A curtain controlled the movement of air around a bed. A quilt edge controlled whether warm air remained around a sleeping child. Even the bodies inside the house became working parts. People carried fuel, generated heat, noticed drafts, repaired cloth, moved furniture, shared beds, and altered routines according to weather. They supplied the intelligence the building lacked. The household adapted the farmhouse to winter through reduction. Instead of warming every room, the family concentrated life in fewer spaces. Summer movement through parlours, upstairs chambers, yards, sheds, and work areas narrowed after dark. The kitchen or main room absorbed more functions until it resembled an entire household compressed around iron. Cooking, drying, sewing, conversation, childcare, and heat management occurred within the same limited area. Privacy weakened. Air grew crowded with steam, damp wool, food, smoke, and people. The warmest room was the room where discomfort had been negotiated most successfully. A family might laugh beside the stove. Children might listen to a story. Bread might warm on the table. Snow might press softly against the window. These moments could be remembered with affection. The affection existed beside labour. Somebody had split the wood. A seam had been repaired. A colder chair had been accepted. The first riser was already part of tomorrow morning. The system created comfort by moving cost out of view. Sometimes the cost moved outside, into the woodlot and the body swinging the axe. Sometimes it moved upstairs, into the colder room assigned to a worker or child. Sometimes it moved into the future, when the household burned more fuel tonight and left less for the next cold spell. Warmth was transferred. A closed door meant one room remained colder, so another could stay warmer. A foot warmer meant heat from the main fire had been concentrated beneath one person. A shared bed meant privacy had been exchanged for body heat. A thick quilt meant fabric, time, sewing, maintenance, and access to material had been gathered into one protective layer. Nothing in the house solved winter alone. The stove without fuel was iron. The quilt without body heat was cloth. The wall without repair became a path for wind. The family without planning woke to a dead fire and a colder morning. The power of the system came from sequence. Wood had to be prepared before winter. Fuel had to be carried before the room cooled. Clothing had to be dried before bedtime. The bed had to be warmed shortly before use. The fire had to be managed before the household left the room. Each action worked because another action came before it. Miss the sequence and cold gained time. Experience mattered because a person did not need to explain heat transfer scientifically to know which door should remain closed. The household did not need a diagram of airflow to recognize smoke moving in the wrong direction. Knowledge lived in habits. One person knew how a properly burning stove sounded. Another judged the woodpile at a glance. The sleeper beside the youngest child knew which hour the blanket would be kicked away. Someone else knew how long the heavy quilt took to dry and which north wind found the bedroom window. Move to another house and some knowledge had to be learned again. A different chimney drew differently. A larger room cooled faster. A stove model consumed fuel at another rate. A new sleeping room exposed a wall to a different wind. The farmhouse machine came without standard parts. Every household performed its own calibration. Poverty reduced the room for adjustment. A wealthier family could add another stove, replace a damaged window, buy heavier bedding, hire help, or purchase fuel. A poorer family often had to increase labour instead. More cloth was patched, more people shared space, more rooms were abandoned, more discomfort was treated as ordinary. Where money could not strengthen the machine, bodies absorbed the difference. Farmhouses stayed warm at night only if we define warm carefully. The entire structure did not remain comfortable. The family created temporary, uneven zones where warmth could survive. Beside the stove, inside layered clothing, beneath quilts, around shared bodies, and near objects that had carried heat upstairs. The victory was a survivable night. Even that victory remained vulnerable to weather. A longer cold spell increased fuel use. Wind revealed new gaps. Snow complicated access to the woodpile. Illness removed a worker from the chain. A broken stove part or chimney problem forced an immediate change. The machine operated close to its limits because winter could extend beyond the plan. March could arrive with more cold than wood. A late storm could turn careful rationing into shortage. Under those conditions, the farmhouse shrank further. The household gathered closer. Beds acquired extra clothing. Work was reorganized. Every remaining piece of fuel gained importance. The final log beside the stove became breakfast heat, dry stockings, a tolerable room, and the possibility of a surviving ember. This is the image of a farmhouse glowing through snow can be both beautiful and deceptive. From outside, the light suggests the building has defeated the weather. Inside, the family is managing boundaries. A door stays shut. A blanket remains tucked. A draft is adjusted. A child is covered again. The light does not show how little of the house it truly reaches. By the deepest part of the night, the winter machine had nearly stopped moving. Work paused. Doors remained closed. Fuel settled. Bodies lay within the smallest warm spaces the household could construct. The stove released what remained in its iron. The walls slowed the wind but did not silence it. Quilts held warm air against sleeping bodies. Somewhere above, someone shifted and pulled a coat closer over thin bedding. Nothing was perfectly warm. Enough things were warm enough. Then the night began approaching morning. The stove darkened. The floor cooled further. Water waited in the pitcher. Clothes lay beside beds, cold but ready. Under the ash, the household's last stored heat might still be alive. Soon one person would leave the blankets. The winter machine would need to begin again. The winter machine would need to begin again. Morning did not arrive as warmth. It arrived as obligation. The first person awake lay still for a moment beneath the blankets, listening to the house. The room was darker than it had been at bedtime. The air beyond the bed felt motionless and cold. Somewhere below, the stove gave no sound. That silence answered the first question. The fire had weakened. Leaving the bed meant surrendering the warmest place in the house. A hand pushed the covers aside. Stored body heat escaped immediately. Feet searched for stockings, then shoes, then the floor. The floor won the argument. Cold rose through the soles before clothing was fully fastened. A cap, coat, shawl, or whatever extra layer waited nearby went on quickly. Morning dignity could return later. For now, the body needed every available barrier. The bedroom door opened. Air moved through the gap. A second sleeper shifted beneath the blankets but did not rise. The person in the doorway carried a little warmth from the bed into the hall, where it disappeared without ceremony. The journey downstairs was short in distance and long in temperature. Each step moved closer to the stove, but not necessarily toward warmth. The main room had been empty for hours. Chairs stood cold. The table held no steam. The kettle had become another piece of metal. Clothing left near the stove was dry, perhaps, but no longer warm. The window showed the earliest grey of morning. Inside, the fire waited under ash. A stove or hearth that had been managed carefully might still contain living embers. They were not always obvious. The surface could appear dull. The fuel nearly consumed. The room completely cold. But ash is a good keeper of secrets. The person bent close, opened the stove, and disturbed the grey layer with a poker. Dust shifted. A darker piece rolled aside. Then, beneath it, a thin orange line appeared. Not a flame. Not yet. Just enough heat to make the entire previous day matter. The ember was yesterday's woodlot, yesterday's axe, yesterday's final trip through snow. It was the evening draft adjustment, the checked stove door, and the decision not to burn the final log too quickly. Now it became the beginning of breakfast. Dry kindling was arranged around it. Thin pieces came first, because a weak ember could not immediately persuade a heavy log. Air had to reach the right place. The draught opened. The first riser leaned close and watched. A breath might help an open ember, though smoke had its own opinions about cooperation. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a shaving darkened at the edge. A thread of smoke rose. A small flame appeared, disappeared, and returned. Another piece caught. The room had not become warm, but the process had begun. This was the quiet gamble of every cold morning. If the ember survived, the household saved time, effort, and kindling. If it had died completely, the fire had to be rebuilt from a colder beginning. A dead stove was not a tragedy. It was more work before daylight. The person crouched near the iron until the flame strengthened. A larger piece of wood entered. The stove door closed. The draught remained open enough to encourage the fire. Then came the waiting. Iron does not become generous immediately. First it absorbs. The flame warms the firebox. The metal begins to expand. A faint click breaks the silence. That small sound is the farmhouse waking. A kettle is filled and placed on top. Water will take time. So will the room. So will everyone else. Morning chores may already be waiting outside. Animals need feeding. Milking cannot be postponed because the kitchen is unpleasant. Snow may need clearing. A worker may leave the house before the stove has returned any real comfort. The first person up often receives the least reward from the fire they revive. They meet the coldest room, perform the first labour, and may leave before the best warmth arrives. Later, another family member comes downstairs. Then another. The room slowly fills with bodies and tasks. Boots are pulled on. Food begins to cook. The kettle murmurs. Hands turn toward the stove. By then, the difficult part has disappeared. The fire looks natural again. That is how household labour hides itself. The finished result enters memory. The warm kitchen, the smell of breakfast, the stove glowing in winter light, the cold floor, grey ash, and person kneeling before dawn slip out of the picture. Yet those missing minutes explain the entire night. The farmhouse never stored comfort as a permanent condition. It stored possibilities. Dry wood could become heat. A quilt could hold it. A closed door could protect it. An ember could begin the morning. Each required a human hand at the right moment. Without hands, the axe did nothing. Without judgment, the stove misbehaved. Without repair, the quilt opened. Without a body beneath it, bedding remained cold cloth. The people completed the system. Outside, the sky brightened over the fields. Snow reflected enough light to make the yard visible. The woodpile stood beside the house, reduced by another night. Its remaining size carried a new question. How much winter was left? No calendar answered that perfectly. A cold spell might continue. A storm could arrive. A thaw might ease the pressure, then freeze again. The family measured the season through supplies as much as dates. The pile was warmth counted in pieces. Another armful came indoors. Wood struck the side of the box. Bark fell to the floor. The stove door opened, and the morning flame accepted what yesterday's labour had prepared. Upstairs, beds began to empty. Each release of blankets allowed another pocket of warmth to vanish. Bedrooms returned quickly to the larger temperature of the house. A child dressed beneath the covers for as long as possible. Buttons were managed with cold fingers. Another sleeper remained still, hoping an extra minute might persuade the morning to improve. It would not. The improvement was happening downstairs. Log by log. Soon the main room became usable again. Not uniformly warm, not effortless, but warm enough for work, food, conversation, and the next round of preparation. The same cycle would continue through the day. Fuel would enter, ash would leave, clothing would dry, heat would gather around iron and disappear toward the walls. By evening, beds would again wait in cold rooms. A warming pan might pass between sheets. A brick might be wrapped. Quilts would rise around shoulders. Doors would close. The farmhouse would shrink, and the family would repeat the quiet trick that carried rural households through winter before modern central heating became ordinary. They would not warm everything. They would warm what mattered next. A room for supper, water for washing, clothing for morning, a bed for sleep, a small ember for dawn. That ember is the final image worth keeping. Not the bright fireplace from a holiday painting, not a farmhouse glowing warmly in every window, just one orange point beneath grey ash, almost invisible in a room that has gone cold. It contains no romance by itself. It is dirty, fragile, and easy to lose. But somebody protected it through the night. Before sunrise, a hand finds it and gives it air. The ember catches the edge of dry wood. A flame lifts. Iron begins to tick. The kettle waits above it. And while most of the farmhouse is still cold, one small place starts becoming livable again.